Midnight Hollow was a place where the sun seemed to set earlier than anywhere else. Tucked away in the shadow of the old mountains, the small town had long been forgotten by most. But those who lived there knew better than to forget the stories passed down from generation to generation, stories that sent shivers down their spines even in the safety of their homes. The most terrifying of these tales was that of the ghost train, a spectral locomotive that was said to appear only at the stroke of midnight. The tracks it once traveled on had been abandoned for years, overtaken by weeds and time. But every now and then, on a cold, foggy night, someone claimed to hear the distant whistle of a train that no longer existed. The tracks, now rusted and broken, seemed to glow faintly under the moonlight, as if calling out to the dead. Children were warned never to go near the old railway at night. The elders whispered that those who did would never return, their souls taken by the ghost train, forever bound to its cursed journey. But despite the warnings, curiosity always found a way to draw the young and the foolish closer to the danger that lurked in the darkness. This year, the whispers grew louder. It was said that the ghost train would appear again, and those brave or foolish enough to seek it out would find themselves face to face with something far worse than death. Midnight Hollow, with its eerie silence and creeping shadows, was about to become the stage for a night of unimaginable terror. In a town as quiet as Midnight Hollow, there wasn't much for kids to do, especially after school. But for Tom, Sarah, Jake, and Emily, the lack of excitement only fueled their imaginations. They were an inseparable group of friends, bound by their love of adventure and a shared fascination with the town's dark history. Tom, the oldest at 15, was the leader of the group. He had a fearless streak that often led them into trouble, but his bravery was something the others admired. Sarah, Tom's younger sister, was 13 and had a keen eye for details. She was the one who always noticed things others missed: a glint of light in the distance, the rustle of leaves when there was no wind. Jake, also 14, was the jokester, always ready with a quick quip to lighten the mood, though his laughter often masked his deeper fears. And then there was Emily, 12, the quietest of the bunch but the most thoughtful. She had a knack for reading people and often sensed things that were out of place, like a sixth sense that the others couldn't quite understand. The legend of the ghost train was something they had all heard growing up, but it wasn't until this year that their interest turned into an obsession. It started with Tom, who had always been fascinated by the unknown. "If the ghost train is real, we have to see it," he declared one evening as they sat around the fire in his backyard. The others were hesitant at first, especially Emily, who couldn't shake the feeling that this was a bad idea. But Tom's excitement was infectious, and soon, they all found themselves agreeing to the plan. "We'll go on Halloween night," Tom suggested. "That's when the veil between the living and the dead is thinnest. If we're going to see anything, that's the night it'll happen." Sarah and Jake exchanged uneasy glances, but neither wanted to back out now. "We'll need to prepare," Sarah said, already thinking of what they'd need to bring: flashlights, snacks, a map of the old tracks. Jake tried to lighten the mood with a joke, but the tension in the air was palpable. Emily remained quiet, her thoughts elsewhere. She didn't want to disappoint her friends, but something deep inside told her this wasn't just a harmless adventure. The ghost train was more than just a story, and they were about to find out just how real it was. As the days passed, the group's excitement grew, mixed with a growing sense of dread. Midnight Hollow was about to reveal its darkest secret, and Tom, Sarah, Jake, and Emily were about to come face to face with a terror they could never have imagined. As Halloween night approached, the group's anticipation reached a fever pitch. The closer the date came, the more the town's atmosphere seemed to change. The nights grew colder, the fog thicker, and even the stars above seemed dimmer than usual. The legend of the ghost train, once just an eerie tale, now felt like a looming threat, something tangible and real that waited for them in the shadows. The problem was clear: how could they get to the old tracks without anyone finding out? The town was small, and word traveled fast. If the adults caught wind of their plan, it would be over before it even began. They had to be careful, slipping out unnoticed after their families went to bed. The group met at Tom's house to finalize their plan. Tom spread out a map of Midnight Hollow, tracing the route they would take to the abandoned tracks. "We'll meet here," he said, pointing to a spot just outside of town. "It's the closest we can get without being seen." Sarah, ever the planner, had packed a bag with essentials: flashlights, extra batteries, and a first aid kit. "We have to be prepared for anything," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Jake, who usually laughed in the face of danger, was uncharacteristically quiet. "What if the train is real?" he asked. breaking the silence. What if it's not just a story? Tom shrugged, his bravado hiding a flicker of doubt. Then we'll be the first ones to prove it. We'll get pictures, maybe even a video. Everyone will know we were right. Emily, who had been quiet since the beginning, finally spoke up. What if we can't stop it? What if it takes us? The question hung in the air, heavy and frightening. They all knew the stories, the people who went to the tracks and never came back, the ones who were found days later, empty shells of their former selves, eyes glazed over as if they had seen something too terrible to comprehend. But it was too late to turn back now. They had committed to the plan, and backing out wasn't an option. They agreed to meet at 11:30 p.m., giving them just enough time to reach the tracks before midnight. The night of Halloween was here, and with it, the challenge of facing the unknown. As they left Tom's house, each of them felt the weight of what they were about to do. The old tracks were a place where the living had no business being, especially on a night like this. But curiosity, and perhaps a bit of pride, drove them forward. They were about to step into a world where the rules of reality didn't apply, where the past and present collided in the most terrifying of ways. Midnight Hollow, once just a sleepy town, was about to reveal its darkest secret to those brave or foolish enough to seek it out. The ghost train, if it existed, was waiting for them, and they were about to find out whether the stories were true. The cold air bit at their skin as Tom, Sarah, Jake, and Emily made their way through the woods toward the old train tracks. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, casting everything in a murky darkness. The only sounds were the crunching of leaves beneath their feet and the distant hoot of an owl, adding to the sense of unease that gripped them all. They arrived at the meeting spot just as planned, their breaths visible in the cold night air. The old tracks were just a few hundred feet away, barely visible through the thickening fog. Tom switched on his flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness but revealing nothing more than overgrown weeds and rusted rails. "This is it," he whispered, trying to keep his voice steady. The group huddled together, nerves fraying as they approached the tracks. The air around them felt heavy, almost electric, as if the very atmosphere was charged with something unnatural. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, each step forward feeling like a step towards something they couldn't fully understand. As they reached the tracks, Sarah knelt down, running her hand along the cold metal rail. It was old, abandoned for decades, but in the dim light, it seemed almost polished, as if something or someone had been keeping it in use. "This doesn't make any sense," she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. Jake was the first to crack a nervous joke. "Maybe the ghosts have been doing maintenance," he said with a shaky laugh, though no one joined in. Tom checked his watch. 11:55 p.m., 5 minutes, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The group fell silent, each of them lost in their own thoughts. The minutes ticked by, the silence growing heavier, more oppressive. Then, at precisely midnight, it began. At first, it was just a distant sound, so faint they thought they were imagining it. A low, mournful whistle echoed through the night, growing louder with each passing second. The ground beneath them began to tremble, and the air around them turned icy cold. The fog thickened, swirling around them like ghostly tendrils. "Do you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. They all nodded, too afraid to speak. The whistle grew louder, more distinct, until there was no mistaking it. It was the sound of a train, but not one from this world. A soft glow appeared in the distance, growing brighter as the sound of the train's engine rumbled through the night. The fog parted, and there, coming toward them on the rusted tracks, was the ghost train. It was a massive, black locomotive, its iron body shimmering as if it were made of shadows. The windows were dark, but inside, flickers of movement hinted at figures, passengers who had long since departed this world. The train's headlight cut through the fog, illuminating the old tracks and the terrified faces of the group. The train slowed as it approached them, its wheels screeching against the rails, but it didn't stop. It moved past them slowly, almost as if it were inspecting them, deciding whether or not to claim them as its next passengers. The friends were frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. The train's presence was overwhelming, its power tangible, like a force of nature that couldn't be resisted. As it passed by, the temperature dropped even further, and the sound of ghostly whispers filled the air, unintelligible but unmistakably malevolent. Emily felt a pull, like invisible hands reaching out to her, trying to draw her toward the train. She struggled to resist, tears streaming down her face as she fought against the force. "Help me," she cried, her voice barely audible over the roar of the train. Tom grabbed her arm, pulling her back with all his strength. "We have to get out of here," he shouted, breaking the spell that had held them all in place. The group turned and ran, their fear finally overcoming their curiosity. But as they fled, the train's whistle sounded again, this time louder, more insistent. The fog thickened, obscuring their path, and the ground beneath them seemed to shift, as if the very earth was conspiring to keep them from escaping. The friends stumbled and fell, the cold seeping into their bones, but they didn't stop. They couldn't stop. Finally, they broke through the fog and back into the woods, the train's whistle fading behind them. They collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath, hearts racing as the reality of what they had just experienced set in. The ghost train was real, and it had come for them, but they had survived barely. As they sat there, huddled together, the weight of what they had witnessed settled in. The ghost train wasn't just a story. It was a living, breathing nightmare, the force of evil that prowled the night, searching for souls to claim. And they had been its targets. But why had it let them go? And would it return for them? The answers to those questions were unclear, but one thing was certain: Midnight Hollow was no longer just a quiet, forgotten town. It was a place where the past and present collided, where the boundaries between the living and the dead were blurred, and where the ghost train would forever haunt the tracks, waiting for its next victims. The escape from the ghost train had left the group shaken, but their ordeal was far from over. They had made it out of the woods, but the train's presence lingered in their minds, its chilling whistle echoing in their ears. They thought they were safe once they reached the edge of town, but Midnight Hollow had other plans. As they hurried through the darkened streets, something began to change. The familiar homes and shops seemed to distort, their shapes twisting in the shadows. The air grew thick with a palpable sense of dread, and a cold wind swept through the town, carrying with it the faint sound of the ghost train's whistle. "What's happening?" Jake asked, his voice trembling. The streets, which should have been silent, were filled with an eerie noise, like the creaking of old wood and the distant clatter of iron wheels. The group stopped, their hearts pounding as the ground beneath them began to vibrate, just like it had at the tracks. "It's coming back," Emily whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "It's not done with us." Before anyone could react, the street lights flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. Panic surged through the group as they realized they were no longer in the town they knew. Midnight Hollow had become something else, a twisted reflection of itself, caught between the living world and whatever haunted realm the ghost train called home. From the darkness, the ghost train emerged once more, its spectral form more terrifying than before. This time, it wasn't confined to the tracks. It moved through the streets, its whistle piercing the night like a scream. The train seemed to grow larger as it approached, its black iron body looming over them like a monstrous shadow. Tom grabbed Sarah's hand, pulling her toward the nearest building. "We have to hide," he yelled, but there was no escape. The ghost train wasn't just a physical presence. It was a force, something that bent reality to its will. The group fled into a nearby alley, but the walls seemed to close in around them, the space shrinking as the train's whistle grew louder. It was as if the town itself was conspiring to trap them, to deliver them into the ghost train's clutches. Jake, desperate and terrified, turned to face the oncoming train. "We have to do something," he shouted, though he didn't know what. The train was unstoppable, an ancient power that couldn't be reasoned with or fought. Just as the train seemed poised to overtake them, Emily suddenly remembered something she had heard in one of the old stories about the ghost train, something about the conductor, a shadowy figure who controlled the train and its malevolent power. In a flash of insight, she realized that the conductor was the key. "We need to find the conductor," Emily screamed, her voice cutting through the chaos. "He's the one who controls the train. Maybe we can stop him." The group looked at her, fear and hope mingling in their eyes. It was a desperate plan, but it was all they had. As the ghost train bore down on them, they made a split-second decision to confront the conductor, the source of the train's power. They turned to face the train, bracing themselves for what was to come. The train screeched to a halt just inches from them, its massive black wheels grinding against the cobblestone street. The door to the conductor's car creaked open, and from the darkness within, a figure emerged. The conductor was tall and gaunt, his face hidden beneath the brim of a black hat. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and his presence exuded a cold, unearthly power. The air around him seemed to crackle with energy as he stepped down from the train, his gaze fixed on the terrified group. Tom, summoning every ounce of courage he had, stepped forward. "What do you want from us?" he demanded, his voice shaking. The conductor tilted his head, as if considering the question. Then, in a voice that was both a whisper and a roar. He replied, "Your souls." The group recoiled in horror, but Emily stepped forward, her fear giving way to determination. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice steady. "You can let us go. You don't need to take us." For a moment, the conductor seemed to hesitate. The glow in his eyes dimmed slightly, and the cold wind that had surrounded them died down. But then, as if remembering his purpose, the conductor's eyes flared back to life. "No one escapes the ghost train," he hissed, raising his hand toward them. But just as he was about to unleash his power, something unexpected happened. The first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, the light piercing through the darkness like a blade. The conductor recoiled, his form beginning to waver as the sunlight touched him. The ghost train, too, began to fade, its solid form dissolving into mist. The conductor let out a furious scream, his body disintegrating in the light. "This isn't over," he snarled as he vanished, leaving only the echo of his voice behind. The group watched in stunned silence as the ghost train disappeared, the town returning to its normal, quiet state. The nightmare was over for now,